I'm Spartacus Olsson, and this is Out of the Foxholes, where I sit here channeling the knowledge of my pipe of wisdom, which I have right here, and answer your questions about the Second World War. Just a reminder, Time Goes to Army members get prioritized or even guaranteed answers. More on that later. Our first question comes from Time Goes to Army Captain Bob L. He asks, when discussing the Battle of the Bulge, I heard that a few German generals figured or begged these resources be better served on the Eastern Front. My question is, if the German forces used in the Battle of the Bulge had been diverted to the Eastern Front, could they have made an impact at all, based on the overwhelming size of the Russian army? Also, if diverted to the Eastern Front, how much longer could the Eastern Front have held out with these resources? As you have already hinted, any battle the Wehrmacht fought towards the end of 1944 or thereafter would inevitably lead to defeat. However, strategically picking where said defeat would occur could have had an impact. By this time, while there were undoubtedly many left who still believed in the Endsieg, the final victory served at the hands of total war, the majority of people and soldiers knew that Germany had already lost the war at this point. For some of them, including leading figures of the Third Reich like Reichsführer SS Heinrich Himmler or his deputy Walter Schellenberg, there remained only one potential course that could preserve the Nazi Empire: a separate peace agreement with the Western powers and a continuation of the fight against Bolshevism in the East. If one believed in this Hail Mary attempt, then arguing against the employment of any additional forces on the Western Front makes some sense. And if it had worked, it would have drastically changed the outcome of the war. However, at the time of the Battle of the Bulge, these hopes were nothing short of ludicrous. Yet somehow they were still substantially saner than believing in actual German victory. That being said, there is another related motivation shared by some within the ranks of the Wehrmacht, one that would be acted upon in the final days of the war by General Walter Wenck and his 12th Army. Proponents of this line of thinking did not suffer from the delusions that the Western Allies would allow the Nazi Empire to stand as a bulwark against Bolshevism, but they also knew that the Western Allies treated civilians and military prisoners better, and most importantly, they hated the Soviets much more than the other belligerents. So, essentially, the argument goes that everything is thrown at the Soviets while the Western Allies are allowed to advance unopposed and conquer as much German territory as possible. The idea was that this could improve the livelihood of not only the captured German soldiers, but also the German civilians living in Western Allied rather than Soviet-occupied territory. In this capacity, a fighting retreat in the East while letting the Western Allies march on unopposed, the forces arrayed for the Battle of the Bulge could have made a difference. While some 200,000 men, 600 tanks, and roughly 1,900 pieces of artillery pale in comparison to the Soviet juggernaut in all dimensions, maybe they could have bought an additional day or two. If these days had been used to let the Western Allies advance, it could have changed the look of post-war Germany quite substantially. Even if not done deliberately for the reasons we just outlined, if the troops had been sent east, the Western Allies still likely could have advanced farther, with the Soviets potentially advancing slightly less until the end of the war. So again, even without any deliberate action, sending the troops east instead of into the Battle of the Bulge could have changed the future of Germany. In either case, though, one thing is certain: Germany would have lost the war, no matter where you station these troops. I should also add that Eisenhower and the other Allied generals, not so much the British, but the Americans especially, were actually following the idea of letting the Soviets advance to a certain line and meeting up with them there, and moving the troops. If that would have changed that, well, that's another what if that we'll never know. Our second question comes from Time Goes to Army recruit Diego S. What happened to members of the LGBTQ plus community that were liberated from concentration camps? Were they discriminated against by the Allies? The LGBTQ plus victims of Nazi terror are often among the less remembered persecuted groups. It's crucial to note that the vast majority of LGBTQ individuals sent to concentration camps were gay men, as Article 175 of the German Penal Code specifically criminalized homosexual acts between men. On a side note, there were also women who the Nazis sent to concentration camps because of lesbianism, like Eli Smula and Margarete Rosenberg, and trans people were also persecuted. However, any exact number of imprisonments or executions is impossible to come by. This law became a powerful tool of Nazi oppression, resulting in the arrest of an estimated 100,000 gay men between 1935 and 1945, removing Berlin as the gay capital of the world. It had been during the Roaring Twenties. Of these, 10,000 to 15,000 were sent to concentration camps, where approximately 65% perished. When the Allies liberated the camps, most prisoners were freed after years of unimaginable suffering and acknowledged as having persevered against all odds in the face of the most despicable evil imaginable. However, gay men and others wearing the pink triangle faced a tragically different reality. Article 175 remained in force even after the Nazi regime fell, and both the Western Allies and the Soviet Union, under Stalin, harbored deep-seated homophobia. The successor states in Germany and Austria likewise continued to foster homosexual resentment. All this meant that some gay men were not released after having spent time in a concentration camp, but instead remained in or were sent back to prison to serve out their sentences under the same law that had condemned them under Nazi rule. Furthermore, for all LGBTQ plus survivors, it meant that they were not officially recognized as victims of Nazi persecution. This exclusion denied them access to reparations and robbed them of any acknowledgement of their suffering, leaving their stories largely untold for decades. Something that would only slowly begin to change, with some testimonies beginning in the 1970s and culminating in the first memorial dedicated to gay Nazi victims in Berlin in 2008. So in short, yes, they were discriminated against by the Allies. Next, Nick Macarius, a member of our Time Ghost 1943-44 division, asks, I read in an article recently that following Operation Barbarossa, that while most Ukrainians joined the Red Army to oppose the German invaders, yet there was a significant number of nationalist organizations that collaborated with their German occupiers. Would you elaborate further on these nationalist organizations? What were their goals? What was their relationship like with the Nazi German-administered Reichskommissariat of Ukraine? Okay, so as the Germans began their advance east, many people along the way welcomed their arrival, at least at first. The Germans were seen as liberators from Soviet terror rule. To explain, we can't forget the dekulakization and later Holodomor, which shaped the people's outlook, specifically in Ukraine, but also elsewhere in the Soviet Union. Dekulakization was a brutal political repression campaign in the Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin, conducted from 1929 to 1933. It targeted so-called kulaks, wealthier peasants or landowners, as well as middle-class farmers and any rural residents perceived to oppose Soviet policies. This campaign involved arrests, expropriations, executions, and mass deportations. Around 30,000 people were executed, while approximately 2.1 million individuals were deported to remote, inhospitable regions, including 1.8 million between 1930 and 31 alone. Another 2 to 2.5 million were forcibly resettled onto poorer lands in their home regions. Experts estimate that dekulakization resulted in the deaths of 530 to 600,000 people due to hunger, disease, and executions. A direct consequence of the Soviet policies, including forced collectivization and grain requisition quotas, was the Holodomor. The Holodomor, often referred to as the Ukrainian famine of 1932 to 1933, was a man-made famine that killed an estimated 3.7 million people, primarily in Ukraine. The earlier decolonization played a crucial role in enabling this catastrophe by dismantling the traditional agrarian system, eliminating experienced farmers, and forcing the collectivization of agriculture. These measures, combined with the Soviet government's refusal to provide relief and its deliberate confiscation of grain, turned a bad harvest into a devastating famine. The Holodomor is now widely recognized as a genocide against the Ukrainian people aimed at breaking the resistance to Soviet control. Together, these two related phenomena created and fostered an intense hatred of the USSR in large parts of Ukraine, hatred that was successfully used by organizations like the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, or OUN in short, founded in 1929. At first, its goal was the establishment of an independent, ethnically homogeneous, totalitarian state of Ukraine. In 1940, the OUN split into the moderate OUN-M and the radical OUN-B. The OUN-B, under Stefan Bandera, became radically anti-Semitic and attempted and succeeded in creating a relationship with the Nazis before Operation Barbarossa began. This eventually led to the creation of the Nachtigall and Roland battalions fighting for the Germans against the USSR, almost exclusively comprised of Ukrainian fighters. Beside these coordinated efforts by the OUN-B, there were also other parts of the German war machine that employed Ukrainian fighters against the Soviets, as is the case with the 14th SS Waffen-Grenadier Division, founded as a volunteer division in 1943, also called the 1st Galician. In it, the Germans likewise employed willing Ukrainian nationalists or unfortunate forcibly conscripted individuals. The nationalists, headed by Central Committee leader Volodymyr Kubiovich, hoped that this division could eventually become the backbone of a new and independent Ukrainian army. However, while the Nazis wanted allies in their fight against the Soviet Union, they did not want an independent Ukrainian state. For example, when Bandera and his deputy Yaroslav Stesko proclaimed an independent Ukraine with all intentions of doing everything in accordance with Nazi ideology, they were arrested by the SS a week later and sent to Sachsenhausen concentration camp, spending the rest of the war in German captivity. Continuing with a question from Time Goes to Army specialist Igor Bobrek. How did the Germans consistently manage to inflict more casualties on the Soviets despite themselves being mostly on the attack? For example, you keep mentioning throughout the weekly episodes the huge losses of life for both sides at Stalingrad and the Don, but looking at the casualties, the Soviets suffered more than the entire Axis combined, despite them destroying the Romanian army and encircling the Sixth Army. Are the German soldiers generally more effective than their Soviet counterparts, or is there another explanation? Okay, so the high Soviet casualty numbers compared to German losses can be explained by several key factors that shifted throughout the war. Let's begin with Operation Barbarossa. At the outset, the Soviet Union was almost wholly unprepared. Stalin refused to believe the Germans would break their non-aggression pact, even considering the plentiful evidence to the contrary. This left Soviet troops vulnerable when the attack eventually came on June 22nd, 1941. This lack of readiness, combined with disorganized command and poorly positioned forces, led to devastating casualty figures on the Soviet side. 780,000 alone in the largest encirclement in history, the Battle of Kyiv. Additionally, at this point, there was a stark difference in the quality and quantity of equipment available to individual soldiers. German troops had superior weapons and logistical support, making them far more effective in combat during these early stages. But this changed once Barbarossa failed and the German disaster unfolded at Stalingrad. From then on, all the way until the end of war in 1945, the Germans essentially fought a fighting retreat on the Eastern Front, with some exceptions, of course. So they were not constantly on the attack, and if you look at the whole war in the East, they were definitely on the defense more than on the attack over roughly 4 years. One fundamental truth of warfare is that it is easier to defend than to attack. Defenders benefit from prepared positions, better use of terrain, and less exposure to enemy fire. Now, with the Germans holding this advantage after November 42, proportionally higher casualty figures on the Soviet side naturally followed. And contrary to the Soviets in the summer of 1941, the Germans were not unprepared and overwhelmed by a surprise attack. The Soviet doctrine presents another element of the whole casualty disparity. A country's military strategy is ideally based on its strengths and weaknesses. One of the most significant Soviet advantages was their sizable manpower pool. Therefore, it is no surprise that the Soviet military doctrine relied heavily on large-scale, sweeping movements of infantry supported by armor, artillery, and air power. This approach leveraged the Soviets' vast reserves of manpower, allowing them to absorb higher casualties while maintaining operational momentum. Overall, the disparity in casualties between the Germans and the Soviets was primarily the result of unpreparedness and equipment disadvantages early in the war. This was followed by the high cost of offensives against entrenched defenders and Soviet doctrine, which prioritized overwhelming force over minimizing losses. These factors combined to shape the staggering casualty figures on the Eastern Front. Time Ghost Army Specialist Marcelo Falcon asks, I've read in a couple of sources, don't remember exactly which, that Ost-batalion soldiers that were captured by Allied forces during D-Day were not sent back to Britain as POWs, but rather sent to the Soviet Union where they were placed in prison camps. I've tried to research this a little bit more, but found no real information. Are you guys able to find more insight as to whether these claims are true or not? Okay, so the fate of Ost-batalion soldiers captured by Allied forces during D-Day is a complex and quite troubling topic. Here's what we know. The Ost-batalion consisted of Soviet citizens, often Red Army soldiers who had been captured or defected under duress, but also some White Russians and other opponents of the Soviets, recruited by the Germans to fill gaps in their manpower. By the time of the Normandy landings, thousands of these men were stationed in Western Europe, primarily in defensive roles. When Allied forces captured Ost-batalion soldiers during D-Day, their treatment varied depending on who captured them and their status under international agreements. These men were considered traitors by the Soviet Union and faced severe consequences if repatriated. Stalin viewed any Soviet citizen who had surrendered or collaborated with the Germans as irredeemable, regardless of their circumstances, as the infamous Order Number 270 declared that surrender was an act of treason, punishable by death or imprisonment. The Allies, under agreements made at the Yalta Conference, had committed to repatriating all Soviet citizens, including those in German uniforms. As a result, many Ost-batalion prisoners were eventually handed over to Soviet authorities, often against their will. Once back in the Soviet Union, they were interrogated, frequently sent to labor camps, or executed. The Soviets maintained strict control over the repatriation process, and most Allied commanders complied with orders to send these men back. This policy led to stark resistance on the side of the Soviet nationals, with many prisoners resisting repatriation, sometimes violently out of fear for their lives. In conclusion, many of the Ost-batalion soldiers captured during D-Day were eventually sent to the Soviet Union, where they faced grim consequences. If this answer intrigues you, and you want to know more details about the repatriation of Soviet citizens from Germany to the USSR, Operation Keelhaul, then check out our World War II Legacy special about that topic. Last, we have one short anonymous question. After the Yalta Conference, did the Allies and the USSR already speak of nuclear weapons, or was it kept a secret? Okay, at this point in time of the Yalta Conference, February 1945, the Western Allies, in this case the US and Great Britain, had not yet talked to Stalin or anyone else in the USSR about atomic weapons. So yes, it was still kept a secret, but not a very well-kept one. Stalin had spies, many spies, permeating all rungs of most, if not all, Western Allied governments. with Klaus Fuchs being one of the most valuable ones. In 1940, he informed Stalin about the beginnings of a British atomic bomb program. After Fuchs successfully penetrated the Manhattan Project, he warned Stalin about the Trinity test, the world's first detonation of an atomic bomb. He also cautioned that if it succeeded, an atomic bomb would be deployed against Japan. All this means that Stalin likely knew of American nuclear ambitions since the fall of 1941, and that he knew about the Manhattan Project before President Harry Truman did. The first time the Allies officially discussed the atomic bomb was at the Potsdam Conference, roughly half a year after Yalta, when President Truman approached Stalin and informed him about a new weapon of unusual destructive force. Knowing what you know now, it shouldn't surprise you that Stalin remained unfazed. And that is it for another thrilling episode of Out of the Foxholes, covering topics from Ukrainian national resistance fighters on the side of the Nazis, the fate of LGBTQ plus concentration camp inmates, the Manhattan Project casualty figures on the Eastern Front, and a counterfactual on the Battle of the Bulge. Speaking of atomic bombs, on February 1st, our new Cold War series, War to War, premieres. It will cover the many post-World War II wars in China, Vietnam, Indonesia, and other places, the nuclear arms race, as well as lots of fascinating stuff that happened right after the war, like the skateboard, rock and roll, and the civil rights movement. That will be on the Time Ghost channel, so if you haven't already, subscribe now. Link will be here any moment now. And just because the weekly coverage of the war has ended, your questions have not. So we're continuing with more Out of the Foxhole episodes down the road. We also have a similar format on our Korean War channel called Out of the Dugouts. If you have a question you'd like to ask, head on over to community.timeghost.tv, or better yet, join the Time Ghost Army at patreon.com and ask away. But let me remind you again, do not leave your questions in the comment section below this video. We don't answer those questions. It's thanks to the Time Ghost Army that we can keep on doing what we do. And if you subscribe at captain level or above, you'll get a guaranteed answer to your question. That is it for today. I am Spartacus Olsson, and this was another Out of the Foxholes episode on the World War II channel. Excelsior!